The invention of the tank in the First World War evolved from the idea of a vehicle that could break through enemy lines, using its armor to deflect enemy fire whilst carrying weapons that could overwhelm the enemy forces. Early vehicles were designed as casemates, with the British Mark 1 through 5 having two sponsons containing either machine guns or cannons with limited degrees of traverse. While these tanks were effective, an even more ingenious design originated out of France, the incorporation of a turret that could fully rotate, giving the gunner a 360-degree view around the vehicle. Soon after, the incorporation of a turret would become a feature of nearly every tank design throughout the 20s and 30s. However, what if just one turret is not enough? This was the question of tank designers of many nations in the West following World War I. The first prominent design was the French Char II-C, which was designed in World War I and was equipped with two turrets, one in the front armed with a 75mm and one in the rear armed with an 8mm machine gun. The next major design would come out of Britain, and this vehicle would become the basis of many multi-turreted designs in the future. The Vickers A1E1 Independent was a heavy tank design commissioned in 1922, with its multi-turreted design winning favour with the British General Staff and a prototype being delivered in 1926. The massive design saw one large central turret armed with a 47mm 3-pounder cannon, but unlike the Char II-C, had an interesting layout for its machine guns. Instead of one or two turrets, the A1E1 had 4 machine gun turrets placed around the primary in a layout that gave a 360-degree area of protection. The rear MG turrets could even face forward, and the left rear turret was designed with the ability to be used against aircraft. The Independent represented everything wanted in a land ship: firepower, defense against infantry, and enough armor at the time to break through enemy lines. This is likely why the plans of the Independent were so largely sought after by foreign nations, specifically Germany and the Soviet Union. The exploits of these documents by the latter nation are the subject of today's video.
Throughout history, there have been countless tanks, all designed to kill. But not all have been a success. What happened to the ones that never made it, and why did they fail? My name is ConeOfArc. Join me as we journey through time, uncovering failed projects and forgotten creations in Cursed by Design.
This video has been sponsored by the Tank Encyclopedia magazine. Obviously, if you're watching this video, you have an interest in tanks and tank history. If you want to get even more information in an easy-to-read monthly release, you can do so for only $5 a month on Payhip and Amazon. I'll leave links to both options down below, although I recommend looking at the Payhip first, as there are even cheaper options available there. I use the Tank Encyclopedia very often when researching my videos, so I'm thrilled to have them as a sponsor, and I hope you all give their magazine a chance. Now let's talk about a wacky Russian design. The origins of the SMK and T-100 come out of a different tank project, one that many of you may be familiar with, the T-35. The T-35 was a result of the Red Army's interest in multi-turreted heavy tanks and was heavily inspired by the Independent. It was even larger than the Independent, being 9.72 meters long, 31 feet, and 45 tons. The major difference was that the Russians took the firepower requirement to a new level. The main turret housed a 76mm gun, while two secondary turrets were armed with 45mm guns similar to that of the BT-5 and T-26, and two other turrets were armed with machine guns. It also had up to 30mm of armor, which was respectable for the early 1930s. While the T-35 seemed like a monster, the only benefits it gave the Soviets were its ability to be a good propaganda vehicle for parades and videos. The tank was very slow, and by the 1930s it was apparent that they were no longer suitable for battle. This is when General Dmitry Pavlov steps in. In 1937, Pavlov passed an order named Resolution 94 SS, which saw a review of the Red Army's stock of vehicles. This included the T-35, which were identified as being obsolete, and therefore a replacement was ordered to be delivered by KHPZ-183, a factory which was busy designing what would become the T-34. The problem with this was that the factory was unable to develop two tanks at the same time, and so the project was given to Factory 185. Eventually, another factory named Kirov Works was added onto the project, and in true Soviet fashion, the T-35 replacement project became convoluted with three companies working on the exact same thing, but with different ideas. In 1939, only two designs survived, Factory 185's T-100 and Kirov Works' SMK, named after Sergei Mironovich Kirov. Both looked very similar to each other, but let's start with ConeOfArc's SMK. The original plans for the SMK were significantly different from the tank we know today, as it was going to have 3 turrets and apparently an octagonal chassis. This design did not get far and was soon changed to a normal design similar to that which was developed. The prototype presented in Moscow in 1938 was one that had 3 turrets and an 850 horsepower diesel engine. It was not confirmed what the 3rd turret was armed with, but it can be assumed that it would have been another 45mm gun facing the rear of the tank. The prototype was approved, but with the requirement that the 3rd turret be removed. This requirement actually helped the tank, as it was able to take the weight used by the 3rd turret to raise the frontal armor to 70mm. An interesting design feature of the tank was that it had 3 compartments, the forward and central fighting compartments, and the engine compartment. The forward and central fighting compartments would be where the crew of 7 would be scattered about, either being assigned to the 76mm main gun and its rear-facing machine gun, the 45mm secondary turret, or the driver's area. The sides of the tank were 60mm thick, while the roof was 20mm. This design was produced in 1939, but according to multiple sources, ConeOfArc already knew that it was not an effective design and began work on a version that had only 1 turret. It would later be known as the KV-1. The T-100 is a tank with not many sources, but it was very similar to the SMK in design and history. It is essentially the same as the SMK, with its original design consisting of 3 turrets in a very large tank. It was also approved with a requirement for the 3rd turret to be removed, and its prototype produced in 1939 looked strikingly similar to the SMK, although the hull and turrets bore a different shape. So now that the prototypes were ready, how did they fare in tests? When sent to Kubinka in 1939, it was found that neither the T-100 or SMK handled themselves well on the testing grounds. The SMK performed slightly better than the T-100, being able to climb out of a 37-degree ditch and also travel at 35.5 km per hour or 22 miles an hour. The main problem that the SMK found was exactly what it was designed to fix when replacing the T-35, transmission failures. While the 2 tanks effectively failed in the Kubinka trials, what would be better than testing them in an isolated test track? Throwing them into a war, of course. 1939 was also the year in which the Soviet Union invaded Finland, with the war starting in November of that year. The 20th Heavy Tank Brigade was assigned the SMK, T-100, and the KV-1 prototype, with the task of attacking the Finnish Mannerheim Line and its various forts. The tanks were tagged with infantry units to provide cover against the fortifications, and according to A.P. Kunitsin, was given the most difficult sector to attack. The first attack was a failure and required the SMK and T-100 to retreat. Kunitsin was also a crew member of the SMK and stated that his tank was never penetrated by enemy fire, even though it received 12.5 slug hits from one of the bunkers. If the crews of the 2 prototypes thought the first battle was rough, then the next day was going to give them and their tanks a run for their money. The SMK may have been lucky before, but during this attack, it became the focus point of Finnish fire. Over 12 hits were scored by 37mm anti-tank guns, but none of these shots were able to disable the vehicle. It fired back, but it is not known what it hit nor if it was effective. The crew would face a major problem when one 37mm shell was successful in disabling the main turret, restricting the tank to only its 45mm gun. If this was not bad enough, while the tank was driving, it hit a Finnish mine that disabled its left track and completely destroyed the track and the torsion bars in its suspension. Apparently, the explosion was even able to damage the transmission, effectively disabling the machine. This left the T-100 as the only remaining multi-turreted behemoth in the fight. The T-100 crewmen, along with a T-28, did their best to cover the SMK from enemy fire, with another 4 T-28s advancing to take up positions with some cover. Attempts were made to repair or to pull it from its position using the T-100, but the damage was too severe and the ground too icy to allow a solid grip. The decision was eventually made to abandon the tank and retreat, with the full crew of the SMK moving into the T-100, resulting in it being overloaded with a total of 15 crew members. This resulted in medals and other awards for the crew. However, Pavlov was distressed by the loss of the experimental vehicle. I can't exactly blame him either, because the last thing I'd want to tell Stalin is that I lost his brand new tank to the Finns. By personal order of Pavlov, a force made up by members of the 167th Motorized Rifle Battalion and the 37th Sapper Company, reinforced with 7 T-28s, were sent in to protect the lost machine. They managed to punch around 100 to 150 meters into the Finnish defenses before being hit by machine gun fire and heavy artillery. After 47 men were killed or wounded, they retreated back to their starting position with the mission unsuccessful. The SMK would remain in its position until the end of February 1940 when a breakthrough was made in the Mannerheim Line, allowing Soviet forces to finally recover it. The task took 6 T-28s to tow the knocked-out vehicle to the Perk-Yarvi railway station. From there it was partially disassembled before being shipped back to the Kirov factory. Supposedly, orders were given to repair the tank after its arrival for shipment to Kubinka, but whether due to material shortages or otherwise, this was never done. The tank remained in storage at the factory until sometime in the 50s when it was scrapped. The T-100 would see a better end, with it being converted into the Su-100Y self-propelled gun armed with a 130mm destroyer cannon and used to defend Moscow in 1941. The Su-100Y still exists to this day in Kubinka. The performance of the SMK and T-100s in Finland would essentially kill the idea of multi-turreted tanks for the Red Army, a lesson that would be learned by nearly every combatant in World War II. However, there is one prototype that survived Finland and would go on into history as a successful heavy tank design, the Kirov Works' second project, the KV-1. The KV-1 showed that the SMK's hull was a sound design, but the incorporation of multiple turrets was problematic in the heat of battle. As with many multi-turreted tanks, the sheer amount of crew and the fact that they were split between turrets caused a problem with communication and fighting capability. The tank may have had guns, but they were not useful if the crew operating them could not cooperate. The KV design did not have this problem, as there was only one turret that allowed the crew to work together in engaging targets. Approved by Stalin, the KV series would go on to be involved in the defense of the USSR, with the prototype that served in Finland being captured by the Germans in 1941. While the idea of a heavy tank with thick armor and multiple turrets to engage multiple targets may seem intriguing on paper, these designs generally prove to be ineffective on a modern battlefield. This was especially the case in the Red Army, with the T-35, SMK, and T-100 proving to be unable to handle themselves in battle while being a massive target for enemy fire. The SMK would live a short and failed career, while the T-100 would only live on in the form of a massive self-propelled gun. Neither would find themselves inspiring future designs, with the Red Army quickly moving on towards tanks like the T-34 and eventually the IS series. The SMK and T-100 may have been cursed by their design, but that does not mean we can't look back and enjoy the idea of such behemoths and learn from their mistakes. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to show it by liking it and subscribing to the channel. Huge thanks, as always, to my ConelyFans who helped to make this content possible through their support, as well as Lord Captain Teapot for his research which went into creating this video. If you want to check out another, even worse failure caused by a lack of communication, check out my video on Operation Vikinga, which was by far one of Germany's worst military disasters of the Second World War. I'll see you there.